Let me first thank the Foreign Policy Association for this invitation and to thank Hunter College for the invitation, too. I'm impressed with the Nobel Prize winners. I'm a graduate of the Marine Corps Officer Candidate School, and we have yet to have a Nobel Prize winner. When I was asked to come speak, I was given this topic, Iraq, where do we go from here? And honestly, I really did not want to do this. I did not want to address this topic. It's become a question I get asked weekly. It's become one that's become more difficult to answer. I have a friend who is a journalist for one of the leading news magazines here in the United States. He calls me every single week and asks me this question. It will go something like this. What do you think about what happened this week in Iraq? And then he will finish by saying, well, General, well, what were you going to do now? What would you do now? And in the beginning, I had a lot of good ideas. And frankly, I run out of them, or ideas that I think are quick solutions or could magically spark some sort of progress. And my message to you tonight would be, from my perspective, that first of all, we need to see this through. And that may not be popular with some people. I know this region of the world. I know the importance now of this mission. I have made my views about how we got into it and how we handled it known, and I won't go into that tonight unless obviously there are questions about it. But once we are involved here, we can't afford failure in this country. We also have to recognize that there is no short-term solution, and I would put solution in quotation marks. There is no easy way out of this. It's going to take time. If you ask me for an estimate, and it would be difficult, I would say that it's going to take 5 to 10 years. 5 years to use a tired phrase now, turn a corner and to see the light. But it's going to be a long, hard slog for a while. Not impossible, made much more difficult by some of the mistakes and some of the methods we made. Some we should have known better, some we couldn't have foreseen. We lost moments. I've spent time in Somalia on 3 tours of duty, 2 tours in Vietnam, as was mentioned. I've been on a number of other peacemaking and humanitarian operations where we tried to rebuild societies. And I know that in the course of events after you intervene, there are what I call the moments. I said in a speech at Lehigh College as the war began that there will be moments, and we have to grab those moments, because those moments either maintain the momentum or give you an opportunity to actually spike it in a positive way. There were moments like when the statue of Saddam came down, moments like when we captured Saddam, moments like when we turned over authority to Prime Minister Alawi. Those moments show hope. Those moments are opportunities to turn things. We didn't succeed in any of those moments to make any significant progress. And when nothing comes out of those moments, hope dwindles. Now, we do have more moments in front of us. Certainly, the most significant one is going to be the elections in January. We also have moments that I would predict we're going to have that aren't clear when they might occur. There will be a moment when some Iraqi unit that we have trained distinguishes itself. It isn't going to be manufactured by us. It isn't going to be backed up by us. It isn't going to be spun by us to make them look good. They will actually stand up and perform well. That will be a moment. That will be a moment for the Iraqi people, a moment of pride, a moment that may say we have turned a corner in terms of training the Iraqis. We need to capitalize on those moments. Those moments need to lead to better times. They need to lead to a better progress in how we apply them. What is failure like in Iraq? I heard the term used today, Lebanon-like. But think Lebanon on a grander scale. That's what we would have, but in a much more dangerous place at a much more dangerous time in the Middle East. An Afghanistan-like environment, Afghanistan before our intervention, in the heart of the Middle East, again at the wrong time. This is not Beirut, it is not Somalia, it is not even Vietnam, and the option to leave isn't there. Now, if you were to ask me what is the goal, what will make this succeed, I can give it to you in fairly simple terms. The objective is to have an Iraqi government that is, one, legitimate, that is seen as legitimate, that is there because of elections, that is there because in the eyes of all those in the world that would recognize a government that is determined by its own people has that stamp of legitimacy. We're going to have to leave a government that has capability, capability recognized by its own people, capability in the areas of politics, in the areas of economics, in the areas of providing for its own security in a reasonable way. It's got to be a government that offers alternatives to the opposition it faces inside its own country and from outside its own country. It's got to be a government that is seen as independent, and maybe primarily independent from us, that it stands on its own, that it has credibility in the region and in the world, and most importantly is seen as independent by its own people. It has to be a government that has coherence. It must be the government of the Kurds, the government of the Shia, the government of the Sunni, the government of the Turkomans, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians. It must be a government that all see they have a stake in and that pulls the country together as an entity, a country which maybe should never have been, but is important to keep its territorial integrity. And it must be a government of acceptance. Acceptance on the streets of Baghdad, Basra, Mosul, Kirkuk, one that you can look to Baghdad and feel that your needs are taken care of, that you have a say in the representation you have there, and a government that can be trusted. Now, what works against this? Well, what works against this is what has been allowed to develop. The enemy is a witch's brew. It is composed of ex-Baathists and Saddam supporters, criminals that were let loose and now find occupation by signing on to conduct acts that either line their own pockets or help support those that pay them to do evil, foreign extremists that have come in from the outside, the al-Qaeda lookalikes or wannabes, or even maybe those that are part and parcel to that organization. There are nationalists there. There are those because they belong to a certain militia, or those because they feel they need to reject the United States, have taken up arms. And they fight under a certain militia, or they fight for a cause that they see as rejecting an occupier. And they're the Mujahideen wannabes. Much like Afghanistan, as it rejected and threw out the Soviet occupation, you have a lot of angry young men in the region that see this is the place to make my bones. This is the place to go off and fight. This is a place to rid ourselves of the occupiers. And so for various motivations, they come there to fight. There's no mystery as to what they're up to. This is a classic Maoist insurgency. As a young officer in the early 60s, we were schooled in insurgency and in counterinsurgency. We were told by President Kennedy that the new war of confrontation as part of the overall Cold War would be to confront communist insurgencies around the world. We studied the different models, the Cuban model, the Leninist model, the Maoist model. This is a classic Maoist model of insurgency. It begins in the first stage by conducting terrorist acts, acts of violence, acts of sabotage, in order to prove the government impotent, in order to attack any occupiers or foreign supporters that seem to be siding with the government, to show the inability of the government to provide for security, to attack along the fissure points, the fracture lines in the country, Sunni against Shia, Arabs against Kurds, and to emphasize those points. In the second stage, they move into guerrilla operations. The sophistication of their attacks pick up. The targeting becomes more specific. The threat to those that would seek to help the government or be part of it becomes greater. And in the later stages of that second stage, they begin to control areas, and they begin to move in larger forces. Now, I would say that this insurgency is in that second stage, and in the early parts, trying to stretch out into the latter parts of that stage where they have controlled areas. And we have seen times where places like Samarra, Fallujah, Najaf, Ramadi, where they've held and tried to hold, and we're involved in operations to prevent that. But like all insurgents, they will fall back to earlier stages and bide their time. The third stage, and most dangerous they wish to enter, is outright civil war. This witch's brew I mentioned doesn't have common cause or common objectives. They probably have an arrangement of convenience now. So what kind of Iraq would come out of a success on their part? It would be a fractured Iraq. It would be a cesspool of the kinds of things that would threaten the region. You would have a mix of semi-theocracies, Afghan-like warlords. You would have the breeding pot for problems that would stretch beyond its borders into the very vulnerable and fragile governments and societies to its south, to its west, to its north, and to its east. I was always taught as a young lieutenant that there are three parts to a counterinsurgency strategy. First of all, you have to fight the guerrilla. I think we all understand that and we see it now. But in addition to that, because that cannot be alone the only action you take, you have to control and protect the people and the resources and the infrastructure. And the third part of that strategy is that you have to improve the environment. You wouldn't have an insurgency, and one that is exceeding or moving through its stages, if there were not popular support, or popular fear, or popular cooperation, or the civil society feeling like they're caught in between and not even willing to take a side. That is exactly what the insurgents want to have happen. And you have to improve the environment where the people have a stake in success. Now, in terms of the actions against these insurgents, the military actions, we have to continue to engage them. I wish there was a gentler, kinder way that I could tell you to do this. When the Marines came back from the first part of their operations in Iraq, when the major combat operations were over, they returned to their bases, and they spent a great deal of time trying to understand how they would deal with the new situation they would find when they went back. I received many calls from the commanders to say, we want to relook at things that succeeded in Vietnam, like the civic action platoons. We want to relook at those humanitarian and peacekeeping operations that you had participated in, General Zinni, and others. What did you learn? How do we connect to the people? How do we, on one hand, make sure we provide security, but on the other hand, do not look like occupiers? How do we help the people? As soon as those Marines returned, they were smacked in the face with the Fallujah situation, and that went out the window. And then we were indecisive in terms of whether we should engage or not engage. We went into Fallujah, partway, backed out, attempted to find another solution that failed, and now we're back into the full fighting that you see now in Najaf, Samarra, and I'm sure you will continue to see in places like Fallujah. We have not made the kinds of adjustments, I think, to the military force we need. There is an argument about numbers. I believe we should have had more forces in there to begin with. My plan did, for what it was worth. I think we are still paying the price for not having sufficient forces on the ground. But more than that, it is the kind of forces you have on the ground. There comes a stage when armor, although necessary, has to be complemented with civil affairs, psychological operations, counterintelligence teams, many of the other skills that are needed for this environment. We can look at how remarkably well our military did in the major combat operations, in conventional battle, something that no nation in this world can stand up to us, armed forces to armed forces, against. But this is an enemy that chooses asymmetry and comes against us in the most difficult way, in acts of terror and in insurgencies that we have not had a great history in being able to deal with. We need to, obviously, as you've heard many times, develop, train, equip, motivate the Iraqi security forces. There's one built-in handicap. We're trying to create an army before we've created a state. That's a difficult situation. It's necessary. It maybe needs to be done in parallel. But the security situation is such that General Petraeus out there now, who is responsible for this training, needs all the support he can get. The equipment, the training, the leadership, the pay, the quality of life for those that we are going to put into harm's way, those Iraqis, has to be top level. As we begin to field these units, we have to continue to do what we have started to do now in Samarra. Integrate them initially with U.S. forces. Now, I believe this is going to be something that takes quite a bit of time. I believe it's a year or 2 years before you're going to see the first really viable Iraqi formations be able to take the field on their own. And maybe more like 5 years before major parts of the country that they'll be able to handle given the current threat level. We need to not delay on getting aid and support for this training. I just read in the paper this morning that NATO has decided to postpone until maybe after the first of the year, providing their trainers and their money. We can't have that. Got to move faster. Those in the region need to take some responsibility for this too. Believe me, those in the region know that a failed Iraq threatens them far more than it threatens us. The pressure, the diplomacy needs to be put on these regional powers to bring in the support for this training. If they can't put boots on the ground, and maybe that's beyond their capability at this point or willingness, they certainly can support the training, the funding, the equipping, the ability for us to communicate to these Iraqi soldiers, to understand what their needs are, to provide the level of advisors and people that understand what their motivations and loyalties are. We need to secure the vital areas, protect the population and the resources and the infrastructure. We cannot continue to have oil pipelines blow up and major facilities blow up and police stations blow up. We need to secure the borders so we don't have the Ho Chi Minh trails that plagued us in the Vietnam War, where they become highways for not only infiltrators, but experienced planners and those that understand how best to attack us, that can fill the void created as they lose insurgents in the battles. There is a flood of suicide bombers. That has to be cut off. Are they coming from inside or outside or a combination of both? Probably the combination. Those Mujahideen wannabes have to be stopped at the border. We have to protect this government. That's the military piece. But you've got to give the people a stake. I've not been able to figure out why we haven't been capable of moving economic development forward. About 6 months ago, 8 months ago, I was in Amman, Jordan, and I met there with a number of Iraqi businessmen who happened to be visiting in Amman. And I asked them about what was happening. And they were very discouraged because they wanted to restart their businesses. And they had gone to the Coalition Provisional Authority and said, how do we restart our businesses? Where do we go for investment and loans? How do we deal with our security? And how do we get your permission to do business? They didn't get an answer. There wasn't a plan. The only thing they were told is, if you were ever a Ba'athist, you can't do business anymore. Many of them threw up their hands to say, you understand, General, we had to say we were Ba'athists in order to even do business under Saddam. Now, whether they had blood on their hands or not, they should be vetted. They should in some way be checked. But if they're capable of creating jobs, how do we get them started? How do we protect their businesses? It strikes me that there is a convergence of issues and functions that needs to happen. One is to identify the Iraqi entrepreneurs and businessmen that can create this hope. In simple terms, create jobs, begin construction, build infrastructure, open businesses, commence trade. Those Iraqi entrepreneurs and businessmen have to converge with investors and donors. We have to help bring those investors and donors to the table to take the risk. Those in the region that have a vested interest in making this succeed. Others, Europeans and others, that have a responsibility and should stand up to this. There's a convergence necessary with those that have contracts in their hands. We have provided $18 billion to contracting. Why are Pakistanis and Egyptians driving trucks? Why is an American driving a truck in Iraq? I can't believe that's a skill that's too difficult for an Iraqi to pick up. We need to insist that these contracts are local hires. We can vet the employment force. We can work through the entrepreneurs. We need to make sure that we don't have isolated conferences for debt forgiveness and loans. It needs to be done at the same place, at the same table, so the government understands how it can provide incentives, to get these businesses started and these jobs. And we need, most importantly, to understand what the security requirements are. If a company is willing to restart and has the investors and can hire its own security, can we interact with that security? Could we provide the 9/11? Could we provide warning? Could we even provide equipment, communications, security equipment necessary? Could we network the security systems to protect this infrastructure? This kind of cohesion, this kind of bringing together the elements for economic development, in my mind, hasn't occurred. In bits and pieces, people work these issues. But this needs to be brought together in a more significant, more permanent way. We may have to develop this by province, not by country. There are 18 provinces in this nation of Iraq. All are not the same. There are quiet provinces. There are provinces that could move forward on their own, that have less of a security problem. We should not try to deal with the lowest common denominator as the base. We should set up models. If you're willing to cooperate, if you're willing to finger the insurgent, if you're willing to work in your own interest, you can be like that province over there, number 3, who doesn't have the problem and has moved forward. We need to internationalize and regionalize this reconstruction. We have held at arm's length those who weren't willing to put boots on the ground. The time for that is over. We need their investment now. We need their attention. They certainly need to understand and should understand why it is important for Iraq not to fail, regardless of how we got there. The point is jobs, 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 and how you create those. On the political side, we are going to have an election in January. I am trying for the life of me to understand what this election means. I see that we have lost a lot of time in preparation for this, and it's difficult for me to see how we're going to get there. There are 35 UN inspection monitors on the ground who are getting shaky boots. I heard this morning on the radio that at the UN they're finding difficulty finding volunteers willing to go to Iraq. No kidding, you know. But this election process is critical. But I think if I were an Iraqi about to vote, I would want to understand, first of all, where are we headed? The questions that are asked by the Sistanis of the world and others, what kind of government that comes out of this? The Talibanis and Barzanis, the leaders of the Kurds. Are we having a federal state, a confederation? What degree of autonomy? What kind of organization are we going to have? The structure needs to be identified so they know what the future is, what they're voting into. The electorate needs to be educated. You can't have the way to vote being preached Friday morning at prayers from the pulpit in the mosque. The electorate has to have an educated understanding of what they're voting for. They need to understand how the different candidates will campaign and what the different parties represent. It's difficult for that process to go on in this environment, but it is necessary. This whole election process is going to need the greatest security of any other function or event in Iraq. Believe me, the insurgents will go after this with a vengeance, clearly. This has to work. It may not be perfect. It may not be that every province can fully participate, but it has to go down in January. And it has to have some structure to it. And time is getting short to move in that direction. The other thing to keep in mind in this is the region. This is not a problem just of Iraq. This is a problem for the entire region, the Gulf, the Middle East. They need to be involved. They need to be consulted. They need in some way to get the incentives and the pressure to participate at whatever level, to invest, to help in reconstruction, to provide advisors. I don't see that kind of process ongoing. I talk to many of the leaders in this part of the region, and I don't get the impression that they're being solicited that hard. We have to understand that Iraq is not a standalone problem. It is related to the Middle East peace process and the lack of progress or involvement there. It is related to the broken relationships we have to this region. It is related to the lack of a solid policy on Iran and what we should do. It is related to the failed or incapable states in this region that need attention. It is also related to what the security arrangement is in this region. The one question I get most out there is, what is the new security arrangement? Think about this. These are countries, these are nations that have had no experience in determining basically their own security arrangement. From the end of the Ottoman Empire, somebody has dictated to them the arrangement. Either a hegemon pops up as an enemy and they have to fall back to the British being the glue till 1971, and then the United States being the glue ever since. From us going to a policy since we started that of the two pillars, Saudi Arabia and Iran, to the Carter Doctrine, to dual containment, to the Gulf Coalition. It's broken now. It's gone. And the question I get asked most often is, what is the replacement? This is much akin to Europe in the interwar period. A lack of trust, a lack of understanding as to what's next, unfamiliarity with providing for their own collective security, the inability to have the trust and the confidence and the capability to come together. Are we going to underwrite the security in this region of the world indefinitely on out? Are we going to push and promote a collective arrangement on their own and then support it? Are we going to have a NATO-like environment out there, something short, something based on maybe more collective cooperation as opposed to more formal arrangements? These are the questions I'm being asked out there. And these are the questions that have to be answered. The future in terms of security, the future in terms of political development, the future in terms of economic development. We have to insist that the movements that have begun now on reform continue. It's beginning. It is way late for some of these countries, but it is beginning. I see elements of democratization in some of the Gulf states. I see women getting the right to vote, run for office. I see social, political, economic change in the way they do business, more transparency, better laws that encourage and promote foreign investment. I see an interest in moving even further. I see a need for them to understand where they need to go, how they need to develop this, support for it, and most of all, acknowledgement and encouragement when they do it. I see the willingness to change, almost out of desperation in all this, and looking to us, and looking at a time when the first world needs to reach out, in some cases to pressure, in some cases to provide the incentives, in some cases to provide the cooperation to move forward. They are looking to us now at this moment. It reminds me somewhat of the two periods after each of the great world wars. After the First World War, President Wilson had a vision, the need to change the conditions that led to war, put an end to colonialism and empires, and change the world. His vision was defeated. We retreated into isolationism, so we were doomed to repeat the event in the Second World War. And then brilliantly, President Truman, George Marshall, who was mentioned this evening, saw the need to change the conditions in that part of the world. The European Recovery Act, the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO, not received too well in this country. The popular support for those programs was very low. Yet their success not only transformed Europe and the Far East, it enabled us to deal with the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, we created a new system, probably unintentionally, but quite remarkably. The first crisis after the Cold War was the Gulf, was Saddam entering Kuwait. President Bush, 41, went to the United Nations and through a remarkable act of diplomacy, achieved in getting a UN resolution authorizing the use of force. He then, through a remarkable feat of diplomacy and military cooperation, created a remarkable coalition. If I were General Schwarzkopf at the time, one of my predecessors, I would have been pulling my hair out because it was a Rube Goldberg kind of lash-up. But it was necessary. It worked. International legitimacy, cooperation, boots on the ground, burden sharing to a great deal. It not only worked there, it not only enabled us to stay within the context of those UN resolutions for the containment that followed, it allowed us to get support for that containment, cooperation in the sanctions, where nations in that part of the world were paying $300 to $500 million a year to support the sanctions, where nations in that part of the world, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, joined us in Somalia, along with Egyptians, along with Pakistanis, joined us in the Balkans when we had another crisis. and joined us again in Afghanistan. It worked. It was a model, again adjusted in some forms, for East Timor, for Haiti, for the Balkans, and all the events that followed. It's gone now. And the new security arrangement is what the rest of the world is asking for, particularly in this part of the world. And we are going to be the ones that determine that. And it's going to be critical that we succeed in Iraq. It is not going to be easy, but failure is not an option here, because this part of the world that stretched from North Africa to the Philippines, from southern Russia all the way down to Central Africa is in upheaval, is in turmoil, is in desperate need of change. The conditions must change, some from inside, some from outside. I have an ongoing set of emails with a number of my friends in this part of the world, senior leadership positions. The subject has been recently that I've been pushing them on Islamic dialogue, the need and the importance for them to encourage Islamic scholars, especially moderate Islamic scholars, to begin the debate. What is Islam? Where is it going? How does this aberrant form that is used as a justification by extremists to be treated or received? Shouldn't it be rejected? Since Beslan and since the beheadings, that dialogue has begun. I'm seeing many of the leaders encouraged by it. My advice to them is support it. Give them the venues and the fora to discuss this. I go to endless conferences that are entitled Islam and the West, or Islam versus the West. In every one of those, I start out by saying, wrong topic. Islam versus Islam. That's what you'd better start with before you come in and talk about how you relate to the rest of the world. Settle on who you are. Define your religion. Define what is acceptable and not acceptable. I'm seeing the beginning of that process. We need to help it and encourage it. There are many things that only they can do. It is going to be a crucial element to solving problems like Iraq that cannot be solved in isolation. I thank you for your attention. I'd be glad to take your questions. Thank you.